All right, let's get started tonight. So, last time on the Conquest, we started looking at the allocation of the land to the tribes, and we used Genesis 49, Jacob's blessing to the tribes, as kind of a way of introducing each allocation. Sometimes it was obvious what it meant. More often than not, it wasn't, but it was still a good way to try to set our frame of reference for that particular tribe. It'll be interesting again tonight. We also looked at Deuteronomy 8, 7 through 10. I'll read this passage again. I really like what Moses says here about the land they're going to inherit. It says, "For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and springs, flowing out in the valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive trees and honey, a land in which you will eat bread without scarcity, in which you will lack nothing, a land whose stones are copper and out of whose hills you can dig, whose stones are iron and out of whose hills you can dig copper. And you shall eat and be full, and you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land he has given you." That's Deuteronomy 8, 7 through 10. And then we looked at different maps. I've been using these maps on the left. These are from BibleMaps.com, the aptly named BibleMaps.com. The one on the right is from the ESV from Crossway, and they're also publicly available online. We were just talking about some of the interesting differences, right? Like here you see how East Manasseh cuts into the territory of Gad, yet there's these little slivers of Gad going up over here. That's not what we see over here. And where it gets interesting is that the territory of Gad, the boundaries are described all the way to the Sea of Chinnereth, the Sea of Galilee along the Jordan. But then when they talk about Manasseh, they talk about Gilead, and that's why they also label this area in here Gilead. If you can see it, it's a bit faded. And that's actually going to come up again, maybe not this week, but next week. I do want to read this quote for you. I found it again. I raided the library for anything I could find, and I found various atlases and different resources, and I shouldn't admit it, this is from the Reader's Digest Atlas of the Bible, so it's a short version. It says, "The question of the tribal borders is one of the most difficult matters to resolve in the historical geography of the Bible." That made me feel better. Joshua 13 through 19 may indicate that a city belongs to one tribe, whereas Joshua 20 through 21 places it in the territory of another. Moreover, Joshua 13 through 19 seems to combine two lists, one of borders and the other of towns, and these may come from different times. For example, only borders are given for Ephraim and Manasseh, while only towns are given for Simeon. Some northern tribes have both, but Issachar's border is incomplete. Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh east of the Jordan are vaguely described. The southern border given for Judah is actually the limit of Canaan. Borders are an elusive matter and subject to change. I think it's actually a pretty good last sentence about how we can look at these borders. This is kind of, to the best of our knowledge, but it's also a snapshot in time. And these borders are going to change and move back and forth. I think another clear example of that is in the territory of Judah. You have the Philistines here. That was going to be a struggle for hundreds of years over who occupied that territory. Still a struggle today, interestingly enough. So we looked at the allocation to the tribes east of the Jordan River, to Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. This is detailed in Numbers 32 and Joshua 13. It was a call out for the clans of Manasseh east of the Jordan. These were men of war. They kind of saw the opportunity that the Reubenites and the Gadites took, and they decided to act as well. We also looked at their fame and their demise in 1 Chronicles 5:23 through 26. Next, we look at the lands that were possessed west of the Jordan, Judah in Joshua 15, Ephraim in Joshua 16, and the other half-tribe of Manasseh in Joshua 17. Richard called out the plain of Jezreel, or the Jezreel Valley, as a fertile land in Manasseh. He also pointed out it's a port of entry for invading armies from the north later on. And you can see it's a very fertile land, complete with airports, whether that's today. Okay. A land in which you will find airports. Okay. And this is a view from Megiddo. After class, Adam discussed with me an idea that his dad had discussed as well about the people of Joseph getting a double portion as their inheritance of the firstborn of Jacob's favored wife, whereas Reuben was the firstborn of Leah. I looked at this idea a little bit in the last week. There are some verses that I think hint at this. Ezekiel 47:13, which I'm not sure how much I want to get into Ezekiel. He's also talking about dividing up the land in Ezekiel. I'm going to stay away from Ezekiel. Anyway, God says Joseph shall have two portions in that section. And then in Joshua 17:17, when we looked at last week, at first I thought that Joshua was saying you will only have one allotment, but he's saying in 17:17, you shall not have one allotment only, but this hill country shall be yours, for though it is forest, you shall clear it and possess it. So there are some hints that the people of the people of Joseph end up with a double portion. And you could even make that case from the standpoint of the two tribes coming from the one person, Joseph, and how like Jacob adopted them. Anyway, I wanted to point out a couple resources too. I talked to these last week, but I didn't put them up on the screen, and people were asking about it later. I really like Blue Letter Bible, blueletterbible.org. I know a lot of people use, I think it's like bible.com. This one, I really like the layout. You can look up different verses, different resources, different translations. You might check out Blue Letter Bible if you haven't before. For last week, we also used some resources from the Associates for Biblical Resources, biblearchaeology.org. We're going to use some of their stuff when we talk about Zebulun tonight. And then I'll also put up here gotquestions.org, which again, I think they get into some premillennialist stuff, so, word of caution there. But what I like is they have a series of very short articles about what can we learn from the tribe of blank. So if you're like, what can we learn from the tribe of Asher? You can look it up and it'll give you a nice quick overview of that tribe. I definitely looked through that. I'm like, okay, I don't want to miss anything in here. So good to attribute my sources, I guess. Okay, so the Good Land, part 2. This is our second in the two-parter here, talking about the division of the land. So when we last left off in Joshua 18, we talked about the surveying of the remaining land. So the tribes that we've described already, it sounds like they were interested in getting after it. They had ambitions to go and possess this land. And it sounds like Joshua is kind of lighting a fire under the other tribes. He says in verse 3 of chapter 18, how long will you put off going in to take possession of the land? So he launches a survey, sends 3 men from each tribe. They go and they survey the remaining land, divided into 7 parts, and then they're going to cast lots to figure out the order of allotment. And before we get into those 7, I wanted to talk a little bit about the land, just kind of imagining, envisioning what this survey might look like. We talked a bit about the idea of cities and villages. When you look throughout these chapters, there's discussion of 14 cities with their villages, for example. When they're listing off cities, they give you a number and they say with their villages. We talked about how in this agrarian society, these villages would be away from the city and closer to the farm and closer to the agriculture, with the extended family and the clan based around smaller villages. A couple of the things I wanted to call out last week, and there's a whole bunch of different ways to view this, but it's also striking to think about the geography of the land of Israel and just the topology of it, the dramatic nature of that. I want to call out a couple of things here. And again, there's different ways to look at this. I like the relief map here on the right to kind of some of this. This is also like a rendering of when they talk about the coastal plains and then the hill country. And then this is like a cross section going south to north of, okay, here's Jericho down here in the Dead Sea, and here's Jerusalem. I'm sorry, it's kind of small, so you can't really read the text, but I'll describe a couple of things about it. The lowest point of elevation in the world is the Dead Sea. It's almost 1,400 feet below sea level. Jerusalem is at about 2,400 feet, which I guess is not too far off from our own elevation here, around 2,700 for the Treasure Valley. But Jerusalem is only about 20 miles from the Dead Sea. So that's like the distance from here to Lake Lowell, which Lake Lowell is at like 2,500 feet. So we have a difference of like 200 feet. They have a difference of like 3,000 feet of elevation in just 20 miles. And sometimes, again, when I look at the flat maps in the back of my Bible, it doesn't really literally stand out, these changes in elevation that the people were dealing with. I'll also point out, like when we talk about Mount Carmel, and we'll mention it tonight, it only has an elevation of 1,800 feet above sea level. Again, we're used to like more dramatic rises and mountains out here in the U.S. West. Mount Ebal has an elevation of 3,000. And as we discussed last week, Mount Hermon in the northern boundary of Manasseh gets up to 9,000 feet. Now, that's more like it. And then at the coast, the elevation is sea level. Okay, I had to throw it in there. That was a joke. That was a bad joke. All right. This is a dad joke. All right. What about mining? I thought it was interesting in Deuteronomy 8. Moses mentioned a land whose stones are iron and out of whose hills you can dig copper. Did the Israelites mine for resources? And if so, where did they do that? So there is evidence of copper extractions in the south at Finan Timnah, and there are large slag remains from smelting at Kirjath in Nahas. This is in the south of what would be Judah towards the wilderness down there. The Timnah Valley is far south. It's in the wilderness of Paran. It's closer to the Red Sea. There's actually evidence of copper mining well before the conquest, even 1,000 years, 2,000 years before this time, and that's one of these ancient mines in the top left on the slide there. Finan, another one of these locations, is close to the Dead Sea in the region of the Edomites. And so on the lower right there, that's the Timnah Valley, and you could see again just the difference from Jezreel that we looked at a little bit ago, how nice it is in the north country, how it's getting a little more barren in the south. But that doesn't mean that it's without its resources and its blessings there too. So iron smelting would come at a later date. The Iron Age is dated around 1200 to 550 BC, so a few hundred years after the conquest. It's also suggested that iron smelting may have been kept a secret by the Philistines in 1 Samuel 13, when it mentions that the Philistines had a monopoly on blacksmithing. They had to go to the Philistines for all their tools, their plowshares. Even though the passage doesn't mention iron specifically, it includes plowshares, which would indicate a tool that's typically made with iron at that time. Okay, that was very brief, but I want to make sure we get back to the allotments, but still look at some of these other aspects of the land as well. All right, so let's get back to Joshua chapter 18, and we'll look at these allotments starting with Benjamin. Here's the blessing of Jacob to Benjamin. Benjamin is a ravenous wolf, in the morning devouring the prey, and at evening dividing the spoil. That's Genesis 49:27. So the boundaries of Benjamin are given in Joshua 18, verses 11 through 19. Here's a map, and again on the left we have the map of the 12 tribes, and on the right Benjamin in particular. It's kind of hard to see, but Benjamin is this land north of Judah over here. So on the east we have the Jordan, on the north Ephraim, on the west Dan, and on the south Judah. In 1821, Jericho is mentioned as the city belonging to Benjamin. And let's look at verse 27. Verse 27 calls out Jebus, and in parentheses it says that is Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is called out, and it's on the border between Judah and Benjamin. So as a result, Benjamin would have a natural alliance with Judah, and they're going to join with the southern kingdom of Judah when the kingdom is divided into Israel and Judah in 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 20 and 21. I won't look at that tonight in the interest of time, but it is part of the alliance there. It should also be called out that Saul, the first king of Israel, was chosen from the tribe of Benjamin. And let's take a look at verse 28. 28 mentions Gibeah. This is the city of Saul, where Saul is from. This is going to be home to the first royal residence in Israel, and that's what the mound, the tell of Gibeah looks like today. And considering the end of Judges, this itself is going to be a massive surprise. Gibeah was the site of an atrocity in Joshua 19 that was somewhat reminiscent and somewhat not of Sodom and Gomorrah, when a Levite's concubine is raped and left for dead. This leads to civil war against Benjamin, and the tribe of Benjamin is almost entirely wiped out. It should also be noted that Benjamin produced 700 skilled left-handed warriors who were crack shots with the sling. Us lefties have to note these things where we can. So it is interesting, again, that this central location makes sense in some ways for the first king, but it's also really surprising given the immediate history before Saul. And again, if you're like, man, I've been studying Benjamin my whole life, this is your chance. If you want to speak up, just stop me, because we're going to kind of keep moving. We can always rewind, too. All right, second tribe, Simeon. This is the second lot. We're now in chapter 19. Here's the blessing given to Simeon. Simeon and Levi are brothers. Weapons of violence are their swords. Let my soul come not into their counsel. O my glory, be not joined to their company. For in their anger they killed men, and in their willfulness they hamstrung oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. So Jacob's blessing here. Jacob foretold that Simeon and Levi would be scattered in Israel as a result of their massacre at Shechem. This is in Genesis 34, following the rape of their sister Dinah. That anger and vengeance never sat well with Jacob. It comes up again in this blessing in Genesis 49. Sometimes the blessings, I'm like, I don't know. But the tribe of Simeon is now cast as the second lot for the land. And just as Jacob foretold, Simeon is scattered in Israel, and they're given an inheritance in the midst of Judah's inheritance. They are given cities and lands in Judah, and they're enclosed by Judah. This is interesting for a couple reasons to me. First of all, they sent out these guys to survey the rest of the land and to come up with 7 allotments, and one of them was like, how about in Judah? They've got too much land. I don't know. I'm not exactly sure where the rationale comes for that. It was interesting, that quote we read earlier from the Atlas of the Bible talks about how just cities are described for Simeon. I think that makes sense, because talking about the cities carves out this inner land in Judah with the cities and the surrounding villages, instead of trying to describe natural boundaries. It's actually, they were given part of this land out of Judah. And the reason for this extra allotment is actually given in verse 9. The inheritance of the people, this is Joshua 19:9. The inheritance of the people of Simeon formed part of the territory of the people of Judah. Because the portion of the people of Judah was too large for them, the people of Simeon obtained an inheritance in the midst of their inheritance. So the tribe of Simeon is not mentioned again. It is mentioned again in Judges 1 when Judah asked them to join in fighting the Canaanites, and some of the epilogue, if you will, of the conquest. If we have time, we'll get to Judges 1 by the end of the quarter. But Simeon is not really mentioned much later. They're not mentioned when the kingdom is divided in 1 Kings 12. But it's interesting to note that it's not, sometimes I think of the south kingdom is Judah. But it's not just Judah, it's also Benjamin as well. And it's also Simeon, because they've been just assimilated, integrated into that tribe. It is interesting that they're called out separately in 2 Chronicles 15:8. The people from Simeon gathered to Asa, the king of Judah, when they saw that the Lord was with them. So they called out that region, that territory, the tribe in 2 Chronicles. Okay. Yep. Yeah? Okay. Can we run you a mic? He's coming.
No, you can't talk yet.
So, it seems to be a nice allegory, looking to the New Testament and being a Christian, hidden in Christ, the Lion of Judah. Seems to be you don't hear about Simeon anymore, and the more I'm like the Lion of Judah, the less there is of me,
Yeah, I like that. Let me be, wholly lost in thee, as the song Sweet Will of God would say. Yeah, excellent. Really good thought. Okay, on to Zebulun. This is the third lot, and we're now moving forward to 1910. The blessing to Zebulun. Zebulun shall dwell at the shore of the sea. He shall become a haven for ships, and his borders shall be at Sidon. This is Genesis 49:13. Okay. You notice anything right off the bat? They're landlocked. The blessing of Jacob says they're going to be by the sea, but they're not. There's Asher's in the way, those guys. They just get in the way there. So what's going on here? So I read this article at BibleArchaeology.org, and it really does a good job of trying to lay out all the different possibilities here about this discrepancy. It quotes Wayne Jackson about this topic and what he said about it. He said, "It is an odd circumstance that some scholars claim Zebulun never did attain the land prophesied by Jacob, while other equally competent authorities argue that the tribal settlement did satisfy the language of the Genesis text. In the meantime, all admit that the boundary specifications of Joshua 19:10-16 are quite vague, some cities not being mentioned by name, while others still lie buried in the dust of antiquity, not yet identified." Josephus actually identifies the borders of Zebulun going to the Sea of Galilee in the east and the Mediterranean in the west. So there is still some Jewish tradition that the borders might be a little bit different than described here. I'll point this out too. This is interesting. This is kind of a recreation. Another Jewish tradition actually has that the seal, the banner of the tribe of Zebulun is of a ship on the sea, which is an interesting idea. So from this article, there's many different theories that the prophecy of Jacob was fulfilled at different times and in different ways. This article pointed out that Zebulun may have actually moved into the plain of Acco, which would have only been about a half day's walk from the sea. And so commerce with the sea and being involved with the sea might have still been a part of Zebulun's economy. So interesting. Again, I'll point you back to BibleArchaeology.org. Excellent article there. If you just Google Zebulun by the sea, it's one of the first things that comes up because it's another curiosity. On to Issachar. Genesis 49:14 through 15, Jacob blesses Issachar, saying, Issachar is a strong donkey, crouching between the sheepfolds. He saw that a pleasant resting place was good, and that the land was pleasant, so he bowed his shoulder to bear and became a servant at forced labor. So Issachar is like a donkey, like a beast of burden that's going to be put to labor. Let's look at the map. Okay, we're now further north again. This is up in this region up here. Again, sorry for the small map on the left. So on the east, we have the Jordan River. On the north, Naphtali and Zebulun, and west and south is Manasseh. If I was to call out a picture from here, and even looking at the map, you can see Mount Tabor listed up here. Here's a colorized late 19th century photo of that mount. Deborah and Barak defeated Sisera at Mount Tabor in Judges. And perhaps it was during this time that the Canaanites put Issachar to forced labor, and that would fulfill Jacob's prophecy of this time. Judges 4:2, and the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. So it is possible that this land was put under forced labor at that time. It should also be called out, Mount Tabor is the traditional site of the Transfiguration. And even though the text doesn't say which mountain, it was in the region in the text as well. So it might very well be the Mount of Transfiguration. It also contains indoor, as you can see in the middle. You see certain patterns like Kiriath or Beth, and you're like, well, what's in? Because in comes up in a number of ones, in a number of city names. In is fountain, so indoor is the fountain of Dor. But this is where Saul famously had his encounter with the witch, and the spirit of Samuel in 1 Samuel 28 is up in this northern country. All right, we're moving right along. Oh, yes, Edward. Got a mic coming to you.
Very good, thank you. There's a very good passage here in 1 Chronicles chapter 12, verse 32, about Issachar. I want to turn there.
Yeah.
These are men who understood the times with knowledge of what Israel should do. And I think that's a very key point of preachers and elders and deacons of our day, and members of the church for that matter. People who understand the times and know what the right thing is to do.
Yeah, very good. I appreciate that. Excellent. Team Issachar coming through. 1 Chronicles. I'm writing this down. Yeah, it's a good one. Okay, on to Asher. Asher's food shall be rich, and he shall yield royal delicacies. Genesis 49:20. So the boundaries of Asher is going to be, it's going to be north to the Phoenicians. It's going to also be west to the Mediterranean. So hold on, I'm looking at the wrong spot. Okay, I wanted to actually go back, and I was looking at Naphtali, getting ahead in my notes. So I wanted to go back and look at this blessing for a second. One of the other quotes I came across was Matthew Henry about this commentary in particular. He said something, and although it's out of context, it really does speak to us in our time. Matthew Henry, who lived in the 17th century, said, "Were the supports of luxury as universal as the supports of life, this world would be worse than it is, and that it needs not be." And that's still kind of haunting today, talking about when your luxury and your indulgences are just as common as your necessities, it can be a danger. So that was actually his commentary on that verse. So for the boundaries here, we've got Zebulun and Naphtali to the east. To the north, you would have the Phoenicians. To the west, the Mediterranean, and south to Manasseh. The seafood? It could be, yeah. And again, this is up in that very fertile land as well. Yeah. yeah. But then again, I've also heard that lobster used to be food for, the common man, which is interesting. It's a good point, though. And certainly trade on the Mediterranean wouldn't have hurt them at all. A couple of features to call out here. Mount Carmel is in the land of Asher, and I didn't realize this, but it's actually a mountain range at about 1,700 feet in elevation. See how it's drawn on this as like a blotch instead of just a spot. So it's about 24 by 5 miles. This is where God, famously sent fire from heaven in 1 Kings 18 when Elijah confronts the prophets of Baal, and there's a picture of it on the left. So I didn't realize it was a range. To Jacob's blessing, being by the sea would naturally, again, be a boon for commerce. Moses, this is another interesting chapter to look at in your own time as well. Moses in Deuteronomy 33 also gives blessings to the tribes. But he says of Asher, he says, "Most blessed of sons be Asher. Let him be the favorite of his brothers." So he was actually, sad to say, he was actually given a blessing. Right. Yeah, Richard. Jews didn't eat shellfish? Okay, yeah, that's a good call out. So no lobster. I don't even know if the Mediterranean has lobster. I'm getting off track. All right, let's go on. Naphtali. All right, this is from Genesis 49:21. Naphtali is a doe let loose that bears beautiful fawns. So now we're making our way through chapter 19. We're in verse 32. And you can look at the boundaries given here. On the east is the Sea of Chinnereth, that's the Sea of Galilee, and the Jordan River. And there's a lot of things I'm learning through this. I didn't realize the Jordan River extends up into the, to where Dan's going to end up being. We'll get to that in a second. And on to the west by Asher, the north you have Phoenicians, and the south Zebulun and Issachar. Some features of this land. Barak is a Naphthalite. That's Judges chapter 4. So some of the judges coming from the north. And then Isaiah 9, if we think about, let's actually take a very quick look there. It's hard not to. Isaiah 9, we'll look at verses 1 and 2. "But there will be no gloom for her who was in anguish. In the former time, he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but in the later time, he has made glorious the way to the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations." And it goes on and makes a prophecy about Jesus in this entire section. But it's interesting to note the language here, the land that was contempt of Zebulun and Naphtali, that this land will be glorified through Jesus and his ministry. I should also point out again that Hazor is in this territory. You can see it north of the Sea of Galilee here. And this was another city that I didn't really pay a lot of attention to until we got into the conquest, because at the time of the conquest, its estimated population is 20 to 30,000. This was a massive city, and you can see on the left the excavations taking place there, which have been going on for the last 20 to 30 years. Okay, on to the seventh tribe, Dan. Jacob blessed Dan, saying, "Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan shall be a serpent in the way, a viper by the path, that bites the horse's heel so that his rider falls backwards. I will wait for your salvation, O Lord." An interesting tag to the blessing of Dan. And Dan is a weird one. Not you, Dan. Let's go. Let's take a look at Joshua 19. This one's actually interesting to read. Joshua 19, verse 40. The seventh lot came out from the tribe of the people of Dan according to their clans. And then it describes this area. Verse 47, when the territory of the people of Dan was lost to them, the people of Dan went up and fought against Leshem. And after capturing it and striking it with a sword, they took possession of it and settled in it, calling Leshem Dan, after the name of Dan, their ancestor. This is the inheritance of the tribe of the people of Dan according to their clans, the cities with their villages. So this is also detailed in Judges chapter 18. And also in Judges chapter 1. I want to quickly turn to Judges 1 because it gives a little bit more detail about how they kind of got the boot. Judges 1:34, the Amorites pressed the people of Dan back into the hill country, again the higher elevations, for they did not allow them to come down to the coastal plain. The Amorites persisted in dwelling in Mount Hermes and Ajalon and Shibon. Okay, so Dan fails to complete the conquest, and we could talk about why that was. But what do they look to do instead? That's detailed in Judges 18. I'll just summarize it. But approximately 25 years later, the Danites, or it could even be a clan of Dan when I was reading, like Judges 18, 19, they're trying to make this pitch to this priest, and they say, why not be a priest for a clan? So I don't know if it's the entire tribe that moves in or just a clan. But they're involved in this incident in what I dubbed the Church of Micah in Judges 17. This guy forms his own church. And then in Judges 18, the Danites come and steal Micah's priest and his graven image, and they go to the headwaters of the Jordan River, so where the Jordan starts out, and they take the town of Laish and capture it and rename it Dan. And they set up the priest and the image of Dan. It apparently remained there through the time of Samuel as well. So it's a weird story. They didn't end up with a lot of space, and they're going to be way up in the Northland up here, as you can see over by Mount Hermon, where the elevation's really going up. Any thoughts on Dan? Dan. They went off the deep end. They're not even mentioned in Revelation. Yeah, that's a good call out. Take a note on that too. Okay, so at the end of this passage, we have the inheritance for Joshua. Let's go back to Joshua 19. In verse 49, when they had finished distributing the several territories of the land as inheritances, the people of Israel gave an inheritance among them to Joshua the son of Nun. By command of the Lord, they gave him the city that he asked, Timnath-Serah in the hill country of Ephraim, and he rebuilt the city and settled in it. These are the inheritances that Eleazar the priest and Joshua the son of Nun and the heads of the father's house of the tribes of the people of Israel distributed by lot at Shiloh before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting, so they finished dividing the land. Here's the modern day picture of Timnath-Serah. You can see again it's a tell, it's a mound, it's built up over the centuries. And it's a beautiful and small passage as well. It's 2 verses, but this great leader of the people, he's being honored. He's given the land of his choosing, and he chooses this land in Ephraim. As you can see just from the picture, it appears to be a very beautiful, fertile land as well, up in the territory of Ephraim. And like Caleb, Joshua is not just about retiring. He's not necessarily about settling down or not doing any more work. He sees the potential in this land, and it says that he rebuilt the city, verse 50, and settled it. So he didn't have to go and conquer it again, but it sounds like there was still work to be done there. It's also interesting, I found an article in the online from the Jerusalem Post at the end of July from this year that excavations have actually started at Timnath. So it's currently being excavated. So we've got about 5 more minutes, so a couple of these remaining topics we'll cover more next week. But again, we see this another transitionary verse at the end of this chapter. So they finished dividing the land. So we've gone through this progression of the conquest, and then the land having rest from war, and then the division of the land. And now we're at another very clear marker in the book, the division of the land is now finished. And we kind of sweeped right through several chapters of the book. So before we get to the Levites, there is still a little bit more allocating to be done. It's time to designate the cities of refuge as God commanded in Numbers chapter 35. So if this was, I keep thinking about this, if this was a movie or a show or a miniseries, we'd probably see some imagined scene of a man running for his life to get to a city of refuge while he's being hotly pursued by another man. The first man, he runs to the city gate of Hebron and he yells, "I accidentally killed a man. We were clearing wood in the forest when my axe head fell off the handle and it hit this guy and killed him. I'm being pursued by his brother who wants to avenge his blood. Please let me into the city. Please judge my innocence." Here's a rendition of what that might look like. This guy, though, I think this elder looks more like the umpire. It's like, safe. Okay. Let's take a look at, debating how much I want to get into this. Let's read Joshua 20, 1 through 6. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Say to the people of Israel, appoint the cities of refuge of which I spoke to you through Moses, that the manslayer who strikes any person without intent or unknowingly may flee there. They shall be for you a refuge from the avenger of blood. You shall flee to one of these cities and shall stand at the entrance of the gate of the city and explain his case to the elders of that city. Then they shall take him into the city and give him a place, and he shall remain with them. And if the avenger of blood pursues him, they shall not give him up to the manslayer into his hand, because he struck his neighbor without knowing and did not hate him in the past. And he shall remain in that city until he has stood before the congregation for judgment, until the death of him who is high priest at that time. Then the manslayer may return to his own town and his own home, to the town from which he fled." Given the limited time, let's actually just look at one more passage. I want to look at Moses' teaching on the city of refuge in Deuteronomy 19, and then it can give you something to think about, and we can come back and discuss it next week. Deuteronomy 19. Moses says, starting in verse 1, "When the Lord your God cuts off the nations whose land the Lord your God is giving you, and you dispossess them and dwell in their cities and in their houses, you shall set apart 3 cities for yourself in the land that the Lord your God is giving you to possess. You shall measure the distances and divide into 3 parts the area of the land that the Lord your God gives you as possession, so that any manslayer can flee to them. This is the provision for the manslayer who is fleeing there may save his life. If anyone kills his neighbor unintentionally without having hated him in the past, as when someone goes into the forest with his neighbor to cut wood, and his hand swings his axe to cut down a tree, and the head slips from the handle and strikes his neighbor so that he dies." See, it wasn't just a trivial example I was giving. "He may flee to one of these cities and live, lest the avenger of blood in hot anger pursue the manslayer and overtake him, because the way is long, and strike him down fatally, though the man did not deserve to die, since he had not hated his neighbor in the past. Therefore I command you, you shall set apart 3 cities. And if the Lord your God enlarges your territory, as he has sworn to your fathers, and gives you all the land that he promised to give to your fathers, provided you are careful to keep all this commandment, which I command you today, by loving the Lord your God, and by walking ever in his ways, then you shall add 3 other cities to these 3. Lest innocent blood be shed in your land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance, and so the guilt of bloodshed be upon you." Okay, so next week we'll get into the cities of refuge, a couple of things to look at there, and then the division to the Levites. And after that, everything should really calm down. Just kidding, there might be a civil war in the future if we're not careful. All right, thanks. Look forward to it next week. Edward.